Good afternoon, or morning or evening, depending on where you are. I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios, and today we're going to be talking about Slate Digital's virtual bus compressors, also known as the VBC. A lot of engineers now are using what's called bus compression, or two-bus compression, master bus compression, and what that is a very light and subtle kind of overall compression that doesn't do very much, just treating every channel, but it just provides what we call kind of a glue, or it just kind of, it's said to hold a mix together and give it some more kind of clarity. So today we're going to do a tutorial talking about how I use it, how I would use it on different types of tracks, what your options are, and generally look in as much detail as we can. Okay, welcome to today's tutorial where we're talking mostly about Slate's virtual bus compressors, also known as VBC. I'll be giving a brief glance at the virtual tape machine, the VTM, although I won't go into too much depth. I'll just show you how I use it on a master bus, because I use it the same every time. And I'll give a quick mention to Slate's FGX. It's not actually something I'm using right now, but I'll show you kind of where I would put that if I were to use it, because that really is kind of sprinkling the dust on top of what is a good mix. So let's move straight on to my screen here. So this is my theme tune. Now let's just give this a quick play. Okay, so it sounds okay, but it sounds a little bit kind of lifeless. So if I hit play again and just turn on the tape machine and rack, if you look at my master bus here, I've got three things going on. Virtual tape machines, VBC rack, which we'll talk about, and Restream, which you'll see in all of my videos at the moment, because that's just sending out so that XSplit can capture the audio. So you don't need to worry about that one. That is just so that you guys can hear exactly what I'm doing. It's a nice shortcut that means I don't have to route cables all around. So, this is without tape machine and rack, and then I'll turn them on. And you hear how those guitars come to life and everything hits and punches a bit. So what I tend to do, let's just look at the virtual tape machine first. So it's got this pretty little kind of bit at the bottom, which we don't really need. All I do on the master output is I put Slate's virtual tape machines on the 1/2 inch 2-track setting, 30 inch a second on the FG9 setting, because that gives me the most headroom, but it still sounds quite tapey. And then I hit play and I watch the meters. And that's roughly where I want it to be, at kind of -5, -3, which is the kind of level that my mix should be at anyway, really. And that's kind of, I know there's a big kind of controversy about whether you need gain staging or not, but I still think that gain staging is good for the mind and good for setting up your master bus appropriately, but it's not necessary, but I find it works for me. So, go away. Anyway, this is the difference between on and off. This little tick box turns it off. So I don't know if you can hear there, but the low end has kind of a 100 Hz thump about it. There's a bit more fatness to the sound, sounds a bit richer, and generally just makes everything a bit more pleasing, which I can't really argue with. I mean, that in itself is one of the goals of a good mix for me. So if I just turn that on and leave it, I'm done. If I was to use the VTM and the meters were in the red, I'd either think about backing down the elements that are going into that, or alternatively, I would turn down the input, which is linked, so it would make sure the output hits the next thing in the chain. Now the thing we really want to talk about today, and the thing that's in the title of the video, is the virtual bus compressors, and that's these. Now I'm just going to save this setting in, I don't know, bank, let's just call it derp, so I don't lose it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn 2 of these off, because the VBC rack is 3 very well-known bus compressors, and you can use them all, and I like to use them all depending on the genre of music, and you can use a little bit of each, and they all have their own characteristics. They all bring something to the table. Now let's just reset this whole thing completely to, can I reset it? Let's look on B. Right, so that's completely reset. Now something that's interesting about the virtual bus compressors is, especially FG Mu, it affects the sound without you even doing anything. So if I turn this on and off and hit play, here everything sounds a bit more lively. So bus compression, let's go back to the start. Bus compression can be very subtle, and it can add kind of a thump or a warmth or a bite to your mixes, and that kind of the elusive glue. And the secret is that it's not adding any of those things at all, because that's not what compressors really do. What it's doing is taking certain things away, and what you are left with is all the things that we described, the punch and the glue and that kind of stuff. Because that's all a compressor does, is it takes away volume at certain points for certain reasons. Now, the most kind of well-known bus compressor is the SSL 4000 G series bus compressor, which is replicated here as the FG Grey. So this is what starts us off. In fact, if I just turn this off, now you know what, I'm just going to load that up there, turn it off, and I'm going to load up just VBC Grey so that we can see this on its own, keep it nice and simple. Now, the 4 knobs on the left here are probably the most important ones, and these ones over here are for kind of clever advanced technique stuff. So let's look at these 4. Now if I hit play, one thing that's worth noting is the threshold is on 0 and the ratio is on 1:1. So right now this will do approximately nothing. So if I hit play, you'll see these needles and the meters don't do anything. Now you'll probably notice that the mix as it stands has quite a lot of kick drum and snare drum poking out, and that's something that's quite common in rock and metal mixes, and that's something that the kind of is glued together by bus compressors quite often, and it's something that I find means that I don't have to do horrible techniques like side chain compression and all that kind of thing, which are really for the realm of electronic music. I mean, you can use them if you need to, but if you really need to, then maybe you should be looking at this kind of stuff, in my opinion. So, the ratio won't do anything. Now, my usual setting for the FG Grey is the 4:1 compression ratio. You can use it on the 10:1 and slam it more like a limiter, but I tend to find this takes some of the life away, and you can use it as 2:1 if it's more of a gentle kind of track, and it will do something, but less so than on a big rock track. Now the next thing to do is hit play and then move the threshold until it starts pulling a couple of decibels off the mix, and watch. Now I've gone a little too far there, and you can instantly hear that everything's a bit quieter. But if I hit play again, you'll notice that the kick and the snare really punch out. and everything else seems to kind of sit together. Now that's really quite an interesting characteristic. Now the attack and release, let's go to these. The attack is quite simple on a compressor. You've got to think backwards. The slower the attack, the more of that punch you're allowing to stay. So generally for me, if I'm trying to flatten a mix, then I'll make the attack really, really fast, but that's not usually what I want to do. I usually want to do the opposite, so I will usually leave either 10 milliseconds or 30 on this, because those are your two choices on the traditional 4000 bus compressor. And if a song really needs the punch, I'll leave it on 30, but if it's already got plenty of punch, I'll tend to leave it on 10. The release, you've got to think of, again, backwards, that if it's a fast song, you probably need a fast release so that it doesn't sound like it's going blah, blah, blah. And you might back that off a little on a track that's got some sort of ballad going on, so that it's got more of a natural glue and not an aggressive compression. So with the attack where we want it on 10 and the release fairly fast, it sounds like this. And I'll turn that on and off. Now it is really quite subtle, but can you hear how it sounds like everything apart from that kick and snare hit sounds a bit more even, a bit more kind of together? Now that's, to me, what I would use that for. Now the mix knob, I don't tend to use with this particular compressor unless I was really smashing it and then wanted to bring a bit of the original back in. But I like the gentle glue that the SSL's doing, so I tend to leave that on 100%. The makeup gain is useful, say, if you're feeling like you've hit the mix hard enough that it feels like you're losing a little bit of volume, or that punch from the kick drum and everything is making it a little too loud, you can then compensate with that. Now the one that's interesting is this HPF. That wasn't on the original compressor. Now what that does is that takes some of the sub out of the compressor's detection circuit so that the ultra low stuff won't make the bus compressor pump. Now again, let's listen to this little clip one more time and listen to the kick drum and listen to it duck everything in the mix. See, my kick's got quite a lot of sub information in, and I like that. I mean, it's not overly subby, it's not killing the mix, but if I start to roll this up as I hit play, maybe let's say 50 Hz, that cuts the sub out of the detection, and you'll notice the needle won't move as much on the kicks now. So now the punch of that kick drum is just slightly making the compressor move, but not really whacking it and making the rest of the mix sound like it's doing that whole ducking, pumping thing. So that's brought a bit of punch to the mix. Now, I tend to stack all three of these compressors, so let's just go ahead and start doing that. The next one I would use is the FG Red. Now the FG Red is their version of Focusrite's Red 3 preamp, named Red. I mean, it's not not actually bright fire truck red here, but the original is. Now this is a bus compressor that Chris Lord-Alge swears by. He says, as far as I know, that it just brings his mixes to life. I would use it in a very similar vein to the SSL, but where the SSL is really quite clean, quite polished, the Red isn't distorted so much as it brings out different qualities. So let's do the same thing. I tend to have it either at 3 or 4 to 1. let's say 3 today, just for the hell of it. I usually use 4, but let's go with 3. I mean, hey, let's go wild, right? So the attack I like to have quite slow, same as on the SSL, the release relatively fast. And then let's hit play on this and then turn this on and off. Threshold. Let's move the threshold until it does something. Hear how that's really ducking the mix now? So let's try the auto release button, because what that does is the release now is going to be dependent on what the compressor is fed, so that might make it more realistic. Now it's still pumping, so let's just bring this HPF in. And also the drive knob should give us quite a lot more forwardness. See, I'm not feeling that this is working for this particular mix, but what I might do is try again with the release really, really fast. Right, so it's still kind of making the whole thing pump a bit, so let's just kill the threshold a little and use the mix control. Try that. So let's bring the mix down to 50% with that threshold really going. See, now the kick and snare are really jumping out of the mix at us, which if they weren't already, then let's just bring down the kick and snare in the mix and see what happens. See if everything suddenly just sits right. Yeah, well you can hear what it's doing, but the FG Red in my experience doesn't suit every mix. So let's turn that one off and let's add the final one in our puzzle, which is the FG Mu. Now the FG Mu is based on the Fairchild 670, which is a very big, very expensive, very rare and hard to find variable mu compressor. It's a big, lots and lots of tubes, lots of transformers monster, and they're used a lot in Nashville, and they've got a certain sound to them where you don't need to use much compression on them. Most of the sound comes from the tubes and transformers, which is why when I turn it on and off, you'll really hear the mix come to life. That's the tubes and transformers doing that. See, no EQ required, so the only thing that I do with this is the input and output I leave nice and fixed, and the threshold I just push up until I'm seeing about a dB of gain reduction, because variable mu means that you don't need to set a ratio for this compressor. The harder you hit it, the higher the ratio becomes, which is quite unusual. It means that if you've got a soft part of a mix, it's quite dynamic, and if you really start to hit a section of a mix, it becomes more compressed. It's really quite clever. It means that you don't then have to police it and automate it, and just you have a dynamic mix by design. So let's hit this and change the threshold. That was just me going in and taking a little bit of the low end out of the snare because that was just bugging me, but that's not to do with the bus compression. So if we look at the rack, all the rack is all three of these in a row. Now you can have these set how you like. If I turn off the middle one, this should be set almost identically. Let's have a look. Right, so there was an auto release which I'll make a little faster there. And the threshold's almost the same, the ratio is the same. How about that? It's really no coincidence that I end up setting my bus compressors very similar most of the time. The only things I'll play with really are the attack and release depending on the song, and then I'll mix the levels into it rather than setting the levels per song. It's called top-down mixing. If you do it that way, then you can hear what the compressors are doing, and then you can quite kind of naturally set your levels for each instrument to make everything behave as it should. And it means that you can feel more confident about your general mix. So if I get rid of those separate plugins now and then turn this back on and off, you should be able to hear the difference between the slightly dull, slightly lifeless mix and the slightly fuller, more even mix where it doesn't sound like it's had the life crushed out of it. It just sounds more rounded, more polished. Yeah, I'm getting a bit of kind of glitching going on the sound. I think that's because I'm running XSplit, and I've got about 17 tabs open in Chrome, and I've got VST Host and Reaper running. So I'll have a look at that for the next session. So that's nothing to do with anything other than me overloading the poor computer. But yeah, right, last thing to quickly mention then is Slate's FGX, which I'll have to put in front of Restream. Now, the compressor on this I just turn off because it's an SSL type compressor, which we've already covered in the VBC rack. We don't want to do yet another layer of compression. If I wasn't using the virtual bus compressors, I'd probably be using this very similar to how we set up the FG Grey. However, all I'm going to do with this, and I'm going to turn on the constant gain monitoring button, which takes everything down by 10 decibels, just so that you guys at home don't go deaf. And it's going to hit the peaks at -10. All I do is I turn up the dynamic perception until the mix sounds right, and then leave the low punch and detail until I've turned up the gain and see if it needs it. So that's all I'm going to do here. Cool, there's still a bit too much low end in that snare. But that's the only gripe I have now. Cool, if I hit that constant gain monitoring button, there'll be another 10 decibels of volume and you'll all go deaf, so I'm not going to do that. But that's something that's quite useful, is constant gain means that it will it will do the limiting in FGX without actually raising the perceived volume, so that you can hear what's going on in the limiting and watch the meters and make sure it sounds right at a reasonable volume. Then when you're done, before you hit bounce or render, you make sure that's unticked, and that will come out at absolutely at like minus 0.1. Or if I hit the dithering and ceiling settings, I have started having this down at -1 dB, which means that it's a bit, well, it's got a lot more chance of qualifying for being mastered for iTunes and their certification. If it's for CD, which is actually quite rare now, then I'll put that at -0.3, because that means there's less chance of intersample distortion. So on playback, there's less chance of it clipping someone's system, even though it's not clipping here. One of the problems with digital to analog converters is if you've got two samples that are really loud, it makes its mind up to put a big hump in between them, and you end up with clipping on their side. So you get distortion on their side despite the fact that your meters said that you were safe, so you've got to be a bit careful about that. Especially if you want a nice clean punchy mix and not just gritty Metallica Death Magnetic type hell. So I hope this has been useful for you, because that was VBC in a nutshell, with a little kind of flick with virtual tape machines and a touch on FGX. You can also use FG Grey on drums, you can use FG Mu on vocals. Oh, quick thing to note, you can reorder these if you like. The sound goes from top to bottom. This is the order that works for me, but if you decide that another way works for you, then go for it. In fact, let's just try flipping FG Mu and Grey. Sounds a little clearer and crisper the other way around, which is quite interesting. I might stick with that for a while and see how that goes. So I may have just learned something today just by talking to y'all. So thanks for watching. Back to the studio. I hope you found this useful. Hopefully we're going to be doing more Slate tutorials in the future. Let us know if you found this useful, and specifically what kind of plugins you'd want us to look at next. Thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and hit the like button. Big thanks to our patrons on Patreon, because you guys really help us to fund this kind of thing, to be able to do more videos, because this takes up studio time. So doing this through Patreon really helps us, so if you could consider checking that out, please do. I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.